What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, an affiliate of Mad in America Radio, broadcasting on KBOO in Oregon, sponsored by Portland Hearing Voices and the Icarus Project, and syndicated on the Pacifica Network. Madness Radio is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio and at madinamerica.com. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and today my guest is Erick Fabris. Erick is a longtime psychiatric survivor, activist, and organizer based in Toronto, Canada. He was part of the West End Survivors in Toronto that set up the first Mad Pride event in Canada. He worked with a patient's council advising to one of the biggest hospitals in Canada, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health Care in Toronto for 10 years. Erick is also the author of Tranquil Prisons, a book that is about community forced treatment. And he's the founder of Crazy Talks and Mad Stories, which is a creative community event in Toronto. So welcome to Madness Radio, Erick Fabris.
Thank you so much for welcoming me, Willa. It's great to talk with you and all the psych survivors and mad people in the audience.
Yeah, it's great. I've known about your work for many years. People definitely need to pick up your book, Tranquil Prisons. I mean, what a title. That pretty much says it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's also a really good framework for understanding what's happening with the mental health system today and how the community has become an extension of the so-called asylum. And we're going to get into some of that in the interview today. But maybe we could just start by just telling us what you're up to lately.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I was wondering that myself. I'm actually not doing much, but it's kind of well worth it. I'm kind of in a semi-retirement in a sense. But it's in a good way. I mean, I still have these events that are really driving a lot of my my heart is really driven by them.
The mad talks and the crazy talks and mad
Crazy
stories.
talks, mad stories. Yeah. People come to these events and they're always interesting. Like, it's just great to see people pulling stuff together from, pieces of real life and pieces of imagination. And so it's great. So that keeps me going.
But what is it an event and at a venue in Toronto, like people, like a cafe or something, or is it online, or how does it work?
It's these days it's online because of COVID, but we've been using a space for free. The only one that we could get for free at U of T, University of Toronto, where I kind of, before the book got started, I was studying there. So we're still using that space, thankfully, and we're about to start using it again now that the COVID thing has calmed down a bit. But I've been letting go a lot of the bigger kind of goals that maybe I had a decade ago. I was publishing a book, and I was spearheading a psychiatric survivor archive effort that we were all doing. I was lecturing at a local university on psychiatrization. I was presenting at Mad Pride events, which I wasn't setting up, but some great people were doing that. And so, all of these things were happening, not just because of me, obviously, but because of so many other people's efforts. And I had quite a bit of, when you're standing on the shoulders of great people, obviously, you can go far. And I think that for me, the more I did all this work, the more it just seemed to become about me, and I didn't love that because I really like it when people are connecting, and I don't really want to be the center of attention. But of course, the only reason I could do all that was because of other people being involved, and I think one of the reasons I got most of the attention was because of privilege. I mean, that's for me, that's one of the things that I've been really working on myself, has been dealing with my own privilege. So I've kind of backed away from all that sort of white male sort of honor roll stuff. And I'm still trying to understand my privilege, but I'm far from it. But the best I can do now is to use, my perks to open up spaces for people to meet, maybe platform somebody else who's got less than I do. So Mad Stories are like events where, crazies of all kinds swap stories, loosely based on real life, we say. so people can, take off into an imaginative space, or they can stay in a kind of a, and nobody's saying, oh, did that really happen to you, um, and the whole point is not to analyze each other's stuff, it's just to let each other speak, right? And it's the same with crazy talks. We try to encourage each other to speak up, and just say what's on our mind. So it's a place for survivors and mad folk to just swap ideas, experiences, topical issues, whatever they want to do. So these are small community events. I'm just trying to leave these events to someone else if possible, but it's not easy. And there's not a lot of POC, 2IT, LGBTQA, disabled people doing the kind of white male stuff that I've been doing. So it's not easy to find people who are going to just take over. But I still feel like something has to be done. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what's happening for me these days. Is I'm just kind of working through some of that stuff, doing as much as I can without putting the center on me, hopefully, even though I kind of know that that's bound to happen. Like, people are bound to associate the stuff you do with I don't want it to become a career thing, but it's a it's a kind of a it's a kind of a paradox. If you do too little, you're going to allow so much to happen, and if you do too much, then you're going to take away from, I think, other people's work. But
Yeah, it makes me think there's a group of people that's coming together. Just the idea of the connections and community being really important. I'm thinking that probably the thing that heals most and the thing that gives power most is when people start to make bonds with each other, not bonds in the sense of like professional client, or bonds in the sense of someone who's working with a service agency or a paid advocate, but just human friendship connections. And so
true.
that's why we got inspired to do Mad Camp, which is coming up in next summer, project that we're working on in California. So I have some parallel thoughts about, what's the heart of it? Like, just gatherings and connecting people and letting people, that was always like what was really important to me about support groups and the Hearing Voices movement and Hearing Voices groups. Kind of what happens in the groups is important because people talk and they share and they get validation, they get responses, they get ideas about how to deal with what they're going through. But really the main thing is just that making friendships, making connections, and having, so that's really great. And so I'm
Without
thinking,
it, I don't know how I don't know how, like, it's a muscle that I lost track of after I got binned, after I got put in the asylum.
mm,
It was just something I couldn't do, was to relate to people. And when West End Psychiatric Survivors started in 92, 93, I went to that, and it was phenomenal because all of a sudden I could connect again, because people were talking about things that weren't forbidden.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
yeah.
I
I kind of
so
joke that going to when we started the Freedom Center, that was the only place I could go and talk with people about how I wanted to kill psychiatrists, because that was what I was feeling.
it's a
Really
feeling.
want I didn't want to really kill psychiatrists, but I kind of did want to kill psychiatrists. And having people be able, like, yeah, me too, I want to, being able to make that connection is so, the taboo is not
Absolutely.
so important. And
Yeah.
but let me ask you, like, okay, so you said crazy people and mad talk, and there are
Hmm.
people might be listening saying, wait a second, where is
What is
this,
this kind
the mad
of?
pride thing? And so that's a question that I have
Hmm.
about your
Hmm.
framing. But also I want to point out that you and I have some similar parallel kind of development, because I think maybe as you were sort of stepping back and kind of taking a look and saying, oh, it's stories and connection, we're also seeing this giant thing happen, which we might call the co-optation of the movement, or the
Hmm.
rise of what gets called the peer
Hmm.
movement. We're like, we even lost our name. We can't even call ourselves survivors. Now we're peers. So that's an interesting parallel. I think it'd be great to talk
Yeah.
about. But let me get back to this question. Like, why did you choose the idea of using the word crazy and mad
Hmm.
and
I mean, when we started Psychiatric Survivor Pride Day, that's what it was called back in
Oh,
'92.
right,
We
right.
had no,
Right.
I'm pretty sure the existentialist kind of side of the movement out in the UK kind of got started with MAD way before that. But for us, West End of Toronto here, it wasn't really a thing. We weren't. I mean, I remember wanting to say, this, we're not just survivors. We're just
Yeah,
different,
totally, totally.
and it kind of didn't pass. Most people were like, well, yeah, but this is what, this is our history. And it's true. That is our history, that we weren't really looking to essentialize or to make, claims about what our bodies were or what our minds were. And the survivor, name or label or whatever people want to call it is really, we're still not being heard or listened to in the mainstream. So
Right.
so I think that was important to start out there. I think it gradually moved over to mad stuff, partly because I remember, being on the council and people would come into the council saying, could I be a member? I'm so, I'm dying to say something back to psychiatry. I'm dying. And I was like, okay, are you a survivor? Like, well, I haven't been hospitalized. I haven't been,
Mm.
I had a something with a doctor, like an appointment once, but I'm definitely crazy. They would say. And I
Uh,
would say, well, yeah, all of us kind of are, or whatever, so there was no way to talk about that middle ground where your
mm,
differences were, something that could be DSM'd, that somebody could say, yeah, you
mhm.
definitely fit into our clinical diagnostic categories. And if we had a chance, if you ever had a rough spell and you came in with a complaint, we would definitely bin you. So um
Bin you mean lock you up.
yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm using
You're Canadian, using a Canadianisms. Yeah.
yeah, it comes from the East Coast. Actually, a friend of mine
Oh,
who now
okay.
lives on the West Coast actually would say this all the time. Picked up from St. John's, Newfoundland kind of
Yeah.
vernacular. But yeah, so
They say bin in the UK too. Means garbage bin. Loony
yeah,
bin,
I guess
garbage bin. Yeah. Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess we're seen as, second rate stuff
Right.
in
Right.
psychiatry. So it was kind of this question about, not only were we focusing on the bad things that had happened to us, and we hadn't had really a conversation about the mad gifts that
Right.
that people bring with their experiences, but also we were forgetting, many many more people who would naturally be allied with us by
Mm.
cutting it off at, surviving a hospitalization or an institutionalization.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I've never been one of the the kind of people who wants to one over the other person. Well, I stayed in longer and I stayed, but those things do matter. If you have been hospitalized, some of the things that you just, people don't believe it still to this day, that people get electroshock, or
Yeah.
that, so those voices need to be heard front and center. But I think we also need to be talking with other people who, if bit of bad luck happens, they'll be binned as well, right? So
Yeah,
uh,
we want to tear down that wall and say we're all human and we all
absolutely.
have our moments. There's two kinds of crazy people, people that show it and people that don't show it. It's basically so but that tension you're pointing to, like, yeah, we want to expand and we want to include everybody who might be labeled or might be seen as crazy, but at the same time we don't want to lose track of this extremely unrecognized experience of psychiatric violence, which
Right.
once you've been through it and you see just the little games of dehumanization that
Hmm.
happen. I was going through my computer the other day and I had a scan of, literally, I was in I was living in a psychiatric residence, and I was reprimanded, and they gave me a sheet of paper that had an X mark because I hadn't put my clothes away into the dresser because they were inspecting the rooms,
Classic. uh,
so and then of course there's the violence of forced treatment and solitary confinement and just the crazy making. There's something about that whole psychiatric inmate asylum experience that's so, it's a kind of extreme dehumanized violence that people don't even believe is real. It's like you're trying to talk about a pedophilia cult or some kind of like extreme form of abuse that people don't believe, incest or something people don't believe. It's like until you've actually been inside of one
Yeah.
of those environments. So the lean towards mad pride, and we all have these creative gifts, and some of us more extreme than others. Let's welcome that broader alliance, and then the tension between that and, well, wait a second, let's not lose the psychiatric
Hmm.
survivor violence focus
Right.
here, is an important thing to name.
It is important. I guess, with, I mean, some people want to go towards madness and then they just reinvest right in the old school kind of ways of thinking about.
Well, Madness Radio, that's a dilemma we have here at the moment. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah, didn't mean to,
yeah. But
didn't mean to
but
point out any names because I mean, this is the thing. At one point, 10 years ago, it was very much about, it's not madness, it's mad people, and all that stuff. And it's
Mm,
fine, but I don't feel like we should be policing each other's everything. But at the same
exactly,
time,
exactly.
there is this kind of the survivor movement didn't get around to the small stuff like labeling, because we were busy with electroshock and forced
Hmm.
druggings and
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
isolation rooms that don't even get, so we didn't get around to the finer things, but some of the finer things like labeling people with schizophrenia or bipolar or whatever, um, can really do a number
They can be
on the.
worse. They can be worse
Yeah,
in
they,
some
they
ways.
they
Yeah.
limit our thoughts, they limit our thinking. So that was another piece for me, when it came to switching from the survivor focus to opening it up to, hey, what about the rest of you folks? Aren't you all crazy? Let's face it, you are all crazy. I know you use the word kind of disparagingly, but why don't you take another look at that word and maybe open up the possibility that it's got more for us than just, somebody we don't want to talk to, somebody who's kind of holding everybody up in line, whatever it is, the nuisances and the all the trajectories that get talked about all the time, right? Yeah.
I like spreading it out too, because it encourages anyone who's in a helper role to identify and empathize that actually
Yes.
the other person, it looks like on the first encounter that this is a bizarre, strange alien, like how, but then if you really look at, yeah, everybody has those little crazy corners. You've had those moments when,
Hmm.
you've completely believed some strange thing that turned out to not be so-called reality based, or you had a belief that you didn't think was reality based that turned out to actually be
Hmm.
reality based. We all have those. And so the idea of a gradient or a continuum or a shared humanity, I think really, really benefits the helpers, so that it's not, you're crossing this giant gulf of difference, but you're actually just
Right.
meeting another human being in this mutual experience, which is life.
Absolutely. And there's I mean, if we really widen the tent to include everybody, because I mean, some people would say, no, 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 I'm not crazy. You know who's crazy? And then they'll start picking picking out
Right.
who people
Right.
who they don't, agree with. Or
Yeah, my
maybe it's the
ex-partner is my
right.
ex-partner
That's
is right. That's really is
stuff like
crazy.
that. The
Yeah.
guy who lives down the street is crazy.
Right.
I'll tell you,
Right. My neighbor.
and
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's, again, it's that disparagement. So anything you don't like, but if you
Uh-huh.
open it up to, well, if everyone is, basically human, people or animals, even, let's open it
Hmm.
up further, then, we're not talking about, distinctions of history as much. And we're talking more about, sort of similarities of experience, like, I mean, you hear
Hmm.
a lot about people saying, well, this kind of person would never have that experience, because of this X, Y, and Z, and their imagination probably couldn't chase after it either, because they've only got these kinds of experiences, you know having been, on what psychiatrists call the illness side of things, you kind of see that, your thoughts aren't as simple as that. Like they're
Right.
they're quite fluid, if you will, or wandering. They're not as, and they can attach in different ways, right? So for me, the mad thing also spoke a bit to this, the possibility that our experiences are connected and overlap, that they're not, just segmented by history and by all the usual isms, right? But
Yeah.
yeah.
Or or broken down into particular boxes. Like I've always had that feeling about like the hearing voices movement. Like, well, yeah, there are hearing voices groups, but frankly, I've never been to a hearing voices group where people weren't also talking about anxiety, loneliness, depression,
Hmm.
paranoia. Like, I'm not
Hmm.
sure that these separations are, they really are arising naturally from our experience so much as they're borrowed from the diagnostic, although some of the experiences some people have and some people don't, they're quite extreme and they're unique and strange. It's a very weird thing to have, is to hear voices outside of you telling you things, and that needs attention. But to separate it from the depression or the anxiety or the paranoia or the interpersonal conflict or the bullying or whatever you're dealing with in your life always seemed to me just heading down the clinical categorization
Yeah.
pathway.
Absolutely. And this is, I'm saying this and I'm catching myself, right? I'm also saying, well, yeah, like as a white male, I might have particular kinds of experiences that inform all of that. My fantasies are my fantasy world, my dreams, my, all of that's informed by my history. It's true, like at the same time, I guess I fall short in my self-examination, because I also keep thinking, and maybe this is delusional or errant or wrong, but I also keep thinking that we have stuff in common. We have a lot in common. In fact, most of our DNA is the same. Most of our speech is the same if we're in the same language group. We use the same kinds of, even people like even me. I will use sanist speech. Stuff that will put down
Mm.
craziness. So with all that commonality, you know yes, we need to look at our differences. There's no doubt about it, and I'm the last person who can come out and say we only have similarities. Because I'm in the top 1% of earners in the world, right? Like, even though here I'm not making a lot, but in the world I'm basically rich, and that speaks to something, right? That if I have to look at the global marketplace in order to get that, then I'm probably privileged in other ways too. So I'm not trying to, distract from that fact, but at the same time, I also think that madness as a concept, let's break it down further. That distress as a human situation can build the bridges that we might need, between us,
Mm.
and it might be different kinds of distress, right? And that's what mad people have shown us, is that, hey, sometimes I'm distressed about invisible bombers who are coming after me in an apartment in Toronto in 1994. I'm not that's what kind of distress is that, right? Like, somebody might say, well, it's not real distress, it's not the real stuff. And my thinking is, we need to listen to each other's worries when they don't even when they don't make sense to us,
Yeah.
um, and take that up as a connection, as a bridge. But again, that's me talking. That's not,
Yeah.
that's just me. So yeah, like I guess I'm doing a bit more reflection in the last few years than I have in the past. But
Well, let's talk a bit about the evolution, let's say, of the psychiatric survivor movement. I think some of the listeners or some people who are tuned into the peer movement or the recovery movement or even the critical mental health or critical psychiatry kind of might forget that the psychiatric survivor movement is still very much a thing. I don't someone was telling me, oh, that's the older
mm,
generation. That's the guys, in the 50s and the 60s who were doing that, like with Judy Chamberlain back in the 70s and
mm,
80s. Like, no, there's actually, we may not have the same prominence. We may not have the same kind of visibility, but the way I see the psychiatric survivor movement, and maybe this is how you see it, it's like, it's really kind of this network of people who have come through something and are trying to make some change around it by using our voices and our stories. And it's beyond organizations, it's beyond institutions, it's definitely beyond who's getting paid and who's not
right,
getting paid, because it's a movement, it's not a career, it's not an
right.
industry. And as long as the oppression exists, there's going to be survivors of the oppression. And as long as there's survivors of the oppression, they're going to be organizing into a movement of resistance, whether it's one
Hmm.
person saying F you to their psychiatrist, and trying to get support around it, or whether it's people coming together for gatherings like crazy talks and mad stories
Mhm.
like you're doing.
Yeah, there's so many things that come through my mind. I mean, I was paid within the system, at arm's length, I guess. They had an
Mhm.
intermediary that would, you know, but it's kind of like how did that work out? And the answer for me became, was like it didn't work out.
It
I
didn't
just
work out.
saw,
Right,
yeah,
right.
I just saw a lot of runaround and a lot of distraction and a lot of like. I mean, I remember the first time
Well, this
I
is when
went
you were
on.
doing the patient counsel
That's
stuff at
right.
the
Sorry.
hospital. So
Yeah, I should.
you were like sort of like an ombudsman, or like a place that would, an advisory council for the hospital to protect patients' rights. Is that
Yes.
like I
Thank you.
think we call them
Yeah.
consumer councils
Yep.
in the
Yep. That
US.
makes sense.
A lot of places, counties and hospitals will have something
They
like that.
they I think the concept got started in Europe in the
Mm,
really early late 80s, early 90s, and it
mhm,
kind of drifted our way. And
mhm.
yeah, like I mean, when they said, yeah, you can help patients, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go on that. Did you just call it code white? I'm going to go down there and check that out. Like this was in the
Mm.
early days when I was just like pissed. And I went into this ward and I saw them all running into this room, and I stood by as they did their work, and they just basically did a chemical restraint on somebody, and it was gross.
They force
Yeah,
drugs on
they just needled them
to
intramuscular. They
control
wouldn't.
them. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Probably
yeah,
for nothing. And
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it was just, I'd only been out of the system for maybe a year, and I haven't been in long.
Wow.
I was only in for about a month or so, and it was long enough, of course, because you don't know when you're getting out, and you don't know where you're going out
Yeah,
to, right?
yeah,
So
that's right.
that could be your life, um, listening to those clowns. But watching them, do this to another person was shocking and abhorrent. And it wasn't maybe a few days later that we had a meeting, that the council had a meeting and this was going to come up. And I believe it was the vice administrator or the second in command at the institution came down and said that I had taken part in this thing and that I had, you know, helped them out and was, like what he was literally lying about what had happened. Yeah.
They're
Like I was
using
just
you for
like,
cover. They're
there,
using you as a
yes,
body shield, like a human shield.
like a human
Don't
shield.
worry, there's a psych survivor who's condoning this.
And
Please don't criticize us.
yeah,
Yeah,
like
oh my
look
God.
at the guy from the patient council just came down here and helped them out with that.
Help them out.
Like
Like,
I
what the
don't
hell?
think
Wow.
so, because it happened to me and it was not fun. Like, I've even written about it in
Yeah.
my book. And but the fact that they would do that, it was just such a backhanded slap. It was just like, obviously you can get away with these things because nobody's going to believe my word over
Oh, yeah.
administrators.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know what I mean? Like, so you get, again, it comes down to how things are viewed. But uh, that was my first instance of seeing how, participation works in government
Right.
or in
Right. What you become part
institutions.
of. Yeah, because like
Right.
the motivation for them hiring you to do that position and your motivation for being there are not the same motivation.
Not the same at
They
all.
want cover for
Yeah, absolutely.
the heat that they're getting. And I mean, this is the co-optation
That's right.
dynamic. And we see this is like how movements die,
That's
basically.
right.
And
No,
so what an incredible emblematic, that's like,
yeah,
it's all right there. Like you're there because you want to help and you're
right.
witnessing abuse and violence, and they're using that to say, oh well, it's okay, the patient council guy was helping out, he was part of it, so it
Yeah,
must have been
yeah.
fine.
Yeah. And that kind of thinking, goes through right to the end. So when they decided to scrap the Patients Council and kind of amalgamate it into a larger council that some people
Mm,
stayed with and others of us rejected and tried to
mm,
push off, it was sort of like you could see the system expanding into the community.
right.
um, Simultaneously you could see the governing body set up CTOs so that
That's the
people.
community, that's the forced treatment in the community. The court says you have to take drugs in the community or they're going to lock you up. Community treatment
Exactly,
or treatment order. Yeah.
exactly,
Outpatient,
IOCs, I guess.
outpatient commitment. Yeah.
Yeah, is
Outpatient
that what
community. I
yeah,
think
so
that's what
you
it's
guys
called in
have a
the
different
US.
name. Everybody has
Yeah.
a different name for it, but
Yeah.
basically it's the same idea. What it is, I would think anyways, is to give cover to the institution So that, like instead of having people getting drugged in a centralized location where there are advocates, where there are third eyes,
Mhm.
they're going to do it in the home. They're going to, like this is partly what my book was about, was watching that transition from the
Yeah.
90s to the aughties, of seeing the way that the institution was burgeoning um, into the outside world. And the peer movement got co-opted in very much the same way. Now an ACT team is going out to see homeless folks. They're going to bring a peer worker with them.
Mhm. Mhm.
They might soften, the situation a bit. Hey, I've been through part of what you've been through. And in
Right.
comes the ACT team to deliver the goods, which is basically the profit motive, the pharma, right? So,
Yeah.
so it's kind of like, watching all of that happen was very much the same as, being run around in the institution while on this advisory committee or whatever. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's they want more cover, like you said. They want more um, range. They want to be able to do what they do elsewhere. And, I'm seeing it all over the place. Like in education, they're putting kids in little rooms or big rooms to, sort of manage them.
Mm.
You see these things happening in jails, obviously. Chemical restraints are happening all over the place.
Yeah, nursing
Meanwhile,
homes, foster care. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, nobody's really talking about the issue in the mainstream press. So, we've got an institution that keeps people kind of running.
Yeah, it's
Um,
ironic. It's ironic to me because somehow the psychiatric survivor, at the same time, a lot of people are saying, well, we have all these successes now. All these peers are getting hired into the system, and there's this recovery language and recovery approach
mhm,
is spreading. And at the same time, it seems like the activism and the militancy, and I use that
mhm,
as Dr. King used it, militant, nonviolent,
mhm,
confrontational exposing of oppression,
mhm,
that has died down. There haven't been like, where is our big national Mad Pride event? Where,
mhm.
I know that COVID affected things, but it seems like the successes of the movement, so called, have accompanied the kind of de-radicalization of the movement. And
Yeah.
then at the same time, you really get a worsening of the problem. The problem isn't really getting
Mhm,
better. There's much more saturation of
mm,
antipsychotics and
mhm.
drugs. The prison system has not been the diagnosis. And then, ironically, where it does come into public view is the discussion around Britney Spears and her
Right.
conservatorship, or
Right.
recently Kanye West. I don't know anything about
Mhm,
Kanye
mhm.
West or Britney Spears, but I do know that a lot of the Kanye West fans sound a lot like psych survivor activists. They're like, Kanye has the
Right.
right to be his creative, expressive self. Stop
Mhm,
diagnosing him. Don't force him on
mhm,
drugs. The people around him who are trying to care for him got him institutionalized. They're trying to get him on those meds. Those meds are going to
mhm.
be interrupting his creative flow. And this guy is a genius, and give him the space. And like, wow, that sounds like the psychiatric survivor movement, but it has zero connection formally, but the
Mhm,
idea is there, but somehow the movement itself has been kind of neutralized to some degree.
mhm.
The people who are talking about, I didn't see psychiatric survivor movement activists on the nightly news talking about conservatorship and Britney Spears. And no, it was, the whole conversation was happening outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a weird
I
thing. It's a weird
it's
thing to watch.
it's interesting watching culture do politics. It's true. Gigi Varanka wrote something on Britney Spears back, what was it now? At least 10 years ago. But, and at the
Mm,
time I thought, wow, Britney Spears, I mean, yeah, we could talk about her, but really?
mm.
And now I'm like, thankfully,
Yeah.
people were talking about
Yeah.
her
She
and
won.
continue to
She
talk about
won.
her.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, she got out and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's weird where people have a soft spot, they'll get political, right? And for me,
Mm.
for me, it was my soft spot was just me. But when other people get sore about a star not being able to say things
There is
as
that.
he's
Yeah, of course. Of
there's
course.
that side of it. but
Yeah.
but at the same time, it's like, yeah, we need to think about the survivor movement, which is certainly not dead. I think we are in a kind of a weird spot, though, um,
Hmm.
because our concerns still aren't front and center.
Right.
We're not going to hear about them on the news. We're not going to hear about them policy wars. We're not, they're just, our issues are like, here in Canada, we've been trying to, push the CRPD. Canada is
Yeah.
saying they're
Yeah.
implementing CRPD. They're doing great, even though they don't agree with like Article 12, which, basically says people have the right to their own bodies and our own, decision making. But, even though they're not all, they're just going to ignore Article 12 because they don't want to go back on SDM, substitute decision makers, and, they don't want to redo all of that, law. And but they're
Mm,
okay with the CRPD, and they're actually implementing it everywhere. They've got mental health acts with all kinds of checks and balances, and it's like,
mm.
no, the checks and balances do not make up for the fact that your mental health act is putting people in hospitals
Yeah, it's
uh,
like a window.
uh,
It's a window
under
dressing
dress.
thing. Yeah, it's
It
the
is.
kind of like
It is.
it's again, it's cover. I don't think the U.S. has ratified the
They
CRPD.
haven't.
I
No, they.
think it's kind of it's stalled here. But again, it's the words, and ultimately
Yes.
the words are going to be interpreted a certain way. I mean, we should remember that the laws that say, well, someone has to be a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or gravely disabled, we know that that is just widely used to
Yeah,
just rubber
absolutely.
stamp violence. We know that. But those that words and those laws came in as a result of psychiatric survivor human rights activism, because
Right.
before
Mm,
those words didn't exist. There was no caveat. It was just whatever the psychiatrist wants to do, they're going to do.
mhm,
There was no intermediary court system. There was no oversight. There was no regulation. So again, we come back to this
mhm,
reality that unless there's an engine, unless there's a fire on the streets, so to speak, of the movement,
mhm,
constantly pushing for what the truth is, it's just going to get spun and co-opted, and it's going to lose its actual meaning. And we're just going to have cover for the existing
mhm. I,
injustices.
but that fire often comes with, let's say in 20 years when peers have become like a settled sediment in the system, and
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be people who are really pissed off about all of the things that are happening. And just like, 20 years, 30 years ago now, when recovery just started, when
Mm-hmm.
before that, nobody even talked about, like,
Yeah.
if you get a diagnosis like schizophrenia, you're done. That's it.
No
Yeah,
school, no work. You're in an institution. That's
yeah,
it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Nobody expects anything from you. Just stop and, stop thinking, stop doing, stop,
Yep.
striving.
It's
It's over,
over. Chronic
you know,
illness. That's it. Yeah. No recovery.
absolutely.
Yep.
So, so recovery is with us now, but what does it mean now? They've taken it, and it means, take your medication daily, so
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
kind of sad, right? Like what we
It,
think of recovery.
it's really disturbing that because the whole idea of recovery, if you think about it in the common sense, it means like you no longer need the antibiotics.
Hmm.
Take the splint off the leg.
Right.
You can go back
Just
to
go back.
work because you don't have the chronic migraines. But somehow all those standards are just erased in the recovery movement. And we say it in a way that's like, well, we want each person to define recovery as their
Hmm.
own. But if you've been psychiatrized,
Right.
if you really don't understand what's going on because you're basically brainwashed
Hmm.
about what's going on, and you say, well, yeah, it would be nice if I could, not go back in the hospital. That's my
Hmm.
definition of
Yeah.
recovery, is this really low
Yeah.
bar. So we live. Are you hopeful? Is there
I
any?
am. I
Yeah.
am
Okay. Tell
because,
me why you're hopeful, because we're going down a
okay.
really dark path here, Eric.
Yeah.
I
No,
mean,
no,
this is really bumming me out talking about
no,
this.
I totally hear you, Will,
Yeah.
because it's the kind of thing that you kind of go, oh my God, all that stuff that I work for, where is it now? And
Right.
I
Right.
looked
Right.
at things like the prescribed harm movement, for example, which I have no, I have no knowledge of
The
really, but it's,
prescribed harm. What do you mean, the prescribed harm movement?
so you'll see it on Twitter if you do hashtag prescribed harm.
Mm.
That's what a growing number of people who've been medicated, quote
Oh yeah,
unquote,
yeah, prescribed. Okay,
um,
yeah, yeah.
is talking about, and
Mm.
it's a huge wave of people
Mhm.
who've, been overdone on psych drugs.
Especially SSRIs. Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely, it's
yeah,
mostly
yeah,
on that
yeah.
side
Hmm.
of the equation. But
Hmm.
when I see that, I take heart because, um, for me, it's not just about, people who are spearheading things, but rather it's also about, what would the ordinary person have to say about what goes on in
That's
psych
right. That's
facilities.
right.
And if there's enough cartoons that mention that people going into facilities are kind of, I saw one thing about the Cookie Monster who was being held down, like, I mean, grotesquely by orderlies, and then they jabbed him. And, you see these kind of weird, references to the very experiences that we've been through. And
Mm,
part of it's kind of dismissive, but there's another part of it that goes, yeah, but where'd they get that idea from? Right?
mm.
Where did the ordinary person come up with this complaint about, prescriptions harming you? I
Yeah.
mean,
I see what
like
you're saying. You're saying it,
from
you're saying it still exists. It's like bubbling up in the culture. It's there at the grassroots. It's in the common sense ordinary, but it just doesn't have the institutional or media or organizational. Yeah, I mean,
or
every time
academic or yeah,
or
yeah,
academic or any or political or legislative or
yeah.
politician that I think that's absolutely true
It's
because
latent energy and it's
it's
coming and
totally
it's
latent energy
growing. It's
because the
growing.
reality is that there's so many people on drugs and there's
Hmm.
just so many people. I mean, this is happens to me. Maybe this people ask me, what do you do? You meet strangers or you're traveling or whatever. And I say, oh, well, I'm a therapist. I'm a rights advocate. So I work with people who are diagnosed with bipolar and schizophrenia. And then boom, immediately they will tell me a story.
Yeah,
It's like, and
yeah,
there's so
yeah.
much. So I think you're right. I mean, the oppression continues to exist, even though the
Hmm.
movement, the organizational aspect of the movement that, let's say, has had this co-optation
Yeah.
process. I mean, every time you see so many evil psychiatrists in the media
Hmm.
and in films, and I'm like, yeah, it's like it's still that spirit is people really get it,
Yeah, yeah.
and
And it's never gone away. I mean, with things like The Cuckoo's Nest, and before that, the
mhm,
Snake Pit, all of those films that brought us those. I guess it's now a mythology because like some people are just
mm,
tired of
mm,
it. Yeah,
mm,
here we go again with that story of being interrupted or whatever. But
mm,
it's so out there, and it's always been around. Like, even when I was a kid, people would say things like, "You don't want to end up in the loony bin," or
yeah,
people would say, so there's a tacit kind of awareness of it. It's just that it doesn't get talked about openly. And
mhm,
um, even the Mad movement, when it was at its kind of height, I think maybe 10 years ago or more, didn't quite crack that. And I think it's going to be hard to crack it because that that glass ceiling, or whatever you want to call it, because there are still people who swear by it. It
yeah,
saves their lives and whatever, and I'm not going to put that down, but I have to ask them, you get what you want from a government and an institution that caters to exactly what you want. Like, do you not want to give us a little bit of space for something alternative to that? Like,
yeah,
please, like, let us out of the chokehold. Let us
yeah,
organize, create spaces that people can go to, talk about wild experiences and not be put down for it, not be, so where's, in terms of privileges, where's the talk about the privilege of having an institution that caters to the way that you want your distress
right. Good
handled,
point. Good
right?
point. Yeah,
Like, where is that? So I mean, we need to, yeah, maybe some of us who are pushy about it need to talk about those things, but I do think that there's a lot of energy still out there in the mainstream, in the sane stream, that
yeah.
that
Yeah.
questions psychiatric violence.
Yeah, and also the questioning the power of pharma. I mean, it just is. It's just not the mental health organizations or the psychiatric survivor movement at all that are leading critiques of pharma. It's just it's happening from other dimensions, but it is happening. There is
Hmm.
kind of like the pharma is clearly established in the popular consciousness as a villain. It's ironic to me that the psychiatric survivor perspective is part of that conversation, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. But this is you touch on something really important, and let's talk about this because what I and my colleagues and the people that I was working with, especially in the Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, we we're really sort of trying to thread the needle and walk a difficult line. And the idea of harm reduction is really where we came up with. So as a useful direction is that look, instead of, and I think also the focus on forced drugging also was part of this walking this line, because if you just say, you know, psychiatric drugs are bad, antidepressants are bad, antipsychotics are bad, mood stabilizers are bad, you get a lot of, you're immediately going to get people like, well, wait a second, I take this helps me. I wouldn't be able to go to work. I got out of the hospital because of this. And there certainly is truth in that experience.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's it's complicated. It's a complicated thing. So what are your thoughts about that? I mean, how do you deal with, like, at the mad talks and mad
Mhm.
stories and crazy talks?
Mhm.
What do you do if someone wants to come up and say, lithium saved my life, and I wrote my novel because of
Mhm.
lithium, or they want to do like the Ellen Sachs sort of like salvation story that we hear so
Mhm.
much
Mhm.
about, the horrors of schizophrenia and the angelic rescue in the pharma insight, that suddenly I finally realized that I need to take my meds. I mean, that was a story we've heard so many times. What do you do if someone comes along and wants to use your platform for that kind of narrative?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and sometimes people who are using that platform, again, maybe don't have the same the same privileges as I do. So I feel like I need to give up some space. Um, Somebody living in poverty is talking about their my psychiatric medication, and I'm like, why do you call it medication? Of course,
Right.
I don't try to pull that stuff. I think, what do I do? I don't know. It
Yeah.
depends on the day,
But you said
but
before about the
it's
not
frustrating.
policing. That's an important piece. Like, we don't
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
label the labelers with new labels. Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want it to be a lockstep kind of movement where
Yeah.
and that's actually part of Judy showed us this, and so many of the other the next generation back showed
Mm.
us how to be strident. Like Don White's was in West End Psychiatric Survivors, so I got a lot from him in terms of, like, when he was looking at, say, a consumer kind of document or something, he would say, well, I don't like that term consumer, you know um like, he would still, though, be able to say, yeah, but some of the things in it are important, like they don't want to be tackled, you know
Yeah.
like some people would specify that they didn't want particular kinds of violence, they might want some other kinds of managing or something, but not, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like, he would find common ground, and I think our movement is it's so in a tough spot that I think we need to do that, is find common ground with people that we don't agree with.
Yeah,
But I
movements, especially in the US, movements can very quickly become religions. And it's all about, like, you have to agree with us, you have to use the language. I mean, I say this a lot when someone says to me, like, I had a bipolar episode. I'm not going to start
yeah,
arguing with them about, well,
right.
bipolar doesn't exist. And yeah, I mean, what I will often say is, oh, what kind of bipolar episode did you have?
Right.
And now they're talking about
Nice.
human
Yeah,
language experience. They're not in this
right,
jargon.
right.
So absolutely. And I think that our movement, if it's not based on compassion and I care about
Yeah.
you, and I care about what you've been through, and let's have some solidarity because we've been through
Mhm.
this horrific institutional violence, then we're not going to get anywhere. But, especially electroshock. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't really feel like I'm pro-choice around
Right.
electroshock. I'm pretty favor of banning
Yeah,
electroshock,
yeah,
drugging children. And I work with people that
right.
their kids are on meds, and I tell them, like, look, I'll continue to work with you, and I want to, but my own, just so you know, my own position is
Right.
that this is not the right thing to
That's
do.
how I kind of that's how I kind of handle most things. It's like,
Mm.
here's my book, or
Right.
yeah, no, I don't, I don't buy into this, or I don't agree with that. But I'm more interested in, seeing other people find their way through the minefield of, the head fuck of this thing. Sorry, I'll
Yeah.
rephrase that. I'm more into letting people explore the issues and the questions that come to them, but I'm not going to tell them how to do that, because I think lockstep movements are really open ground for infiltration. You know,
Yeah,
um,
good point. Good point.
you see people taking up the banner, and they've got all the lingo down, but they're trying to get people to run at the police with like, you can tell they're infiltrators, right? But
Mm.
you can't always name that stuff. But our movement, maybe part of the reason why it's not as popular or out there, is because we do what you're saying. We try to see the human first. We try to see the suffering first, or
Yeah.
we try to give room for that, because that room wasn't given to us
Right
while we
on.
were being binned. So,
Yeah, we weren't
you
given that space to like make those difficult, because people, I mean, and I've been on meds. I was, it's like these are really tough. I took meds voluntarily. I mean, these were
me
really
too.
tough
Hmm.
choices. People are making horrible compromises out of option A is bad, option B is bad, option C. And to not be compassionate about that position
Right.
is exactly, and then programming and lockstep, that's exactly what came at us. So
Hmm.
we don't want to
Hmm.
reproduce that. We don't want to be we don't want to be we don't want to psychiatrize. We don't want to anti-psychiatrize in a
Right.
sense.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Nice way to put it. It's for me, it's an important part of what we do. That's why I was gonna bring it back to Mad Pride there for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Where the ideal was to accept other people's experiences. I still think that's something that has to happen when somebody comes at me from a user perspective or consumer perspective, I guess you could call it, where
Mm.
they're a good somebody I know here in Toronto who's really great at doing this work is has started a number of campaigns now. Roxanne has done some amazing work around this. She and I don't agree on our identities, on what's happening to us or what happened to us, but in the same type of ballpark that we're talking about. So she believes in mental illness. I don't, obviously. Um, I mean, what's there to believe in? It's not even about that. She sees the clinical way of looking at this as helpful for her. I see it as absolutely wrong.
Right,
But
right.
we're not gonna get into a big match about that,
Mm-hmm.
because how am I going to turn all of her experience around? I'm not going to try that. I'm not the boss of her experience. So
Yeah, you're not
I
trying to do a religious conversion over to your
yes,
theology. Right.
like
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
going to let her figure things out as she goes, and the more freedom she gets through the years, probably the more she'll feel safe taking stances like I do, right?
Well, it's
So
interesting because some people tell me like, "Oh yeah, I'm managing my I'm managing my chemistry with these pills. Like this pill helps me to manage my chemistry." And then they'll say, "Well, I also manage my chemistry through my nutrition and through my going into nature changes." And I'm like, "Wait a second. I
hmm
made
hmm
assumptions about what they mean by
right.
managing their chemistry. In their world, everything is managing their chemistry. So climbing inside of someone else's reality and understanding how things are useful or not useful to them, I
Hmm.
think is the key thing. But it's hard to build a movement around that kind of generosity of diversity, because part of me wants to say we need a movement to ban neuroleptics because
Right.
they're poisonous tranquilizers that are not actually treating
Right.
anything. They're just control pills. It's basically,
Hmm.
so I have that kind of tension in
It's true. So
in
do
me.
I.
Yeah.
And we have to be welcoming, we have to be open to different experiences, and at the same time, what do we do when psychs will say, well, so and so doesn't agree with you, obviously we're not going to go your, like, we're not going to make those changes, we're not going to change policy, look at how many people disagree with you. It's very, very difficult, and at the same time,
Mm.
um yeah, it would be it would be a privileged move to impose on somebody who doesn't have as many choices as I do. At the same time, I wonder, how are we going to make the connections? People who, like you and I, agree that electroshock should not be like a,
Shouldn't
how can that
exist.
even be yeah, that's
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
treatment. That's just, that's just an abuse, right? But yeah, how are we going to connect? How are we going to, knit this movement together so that it's viable? That's an open question. I'm not sure about
I'm
that.
curious what you think about, because I've had these conversations for many, many years about the identity and the language of neurodiversity
Hmm.
and neurodivergent. And if I want to very quickly be able to establish my experience, and I want people to kind of like get it that I
Hmm.
maybe am different or have a different, I could just say, oh yeah, I'm neurodiverse. And then boom, there's a whole culture, like activist groups get it. Autism has done an incredible job of pushing this forward. There's so much welcoming. There's so much like accommodation that happens. There's a respect. It's like, oh, Elon Musk is on the neurodiverse, he's like this incredible, Greta Thunberg, all these, it's great what has been done. There's no question
Yep.
at all that this is
Yep.
great. But at the same time, I don't feel like I don't feel like it's right or good for our movement to just be subsumed under that way of thinking
Yep.
for a lot of different reasons. One is that we're trying to fight the idea that our brains are different, because telling us our brains are different is 3 steps from the eugenics and 5 steps from mass extermination. And I'm not exaggerating that.
Nope.
People, once they start to have a genetic profile for so-called schizophrenia, those people are going to be getting abortions. And there's the whole pathway of exclusion and discrimination and banishment and control and exile and starting to parse, like, these are the people who have access to this, these are the people who
Mhm.
can't do these certain kinds of jobs. Once you start going down that biological road, I think it becomes very dangerous. So neurodiverse isn't something, but I have colleagues and friends who are like, they totally
Mhm.
work that, and I think it works quite well. So what do you think about that? Has that come up in the mad
Well,
stories and crazy
it has.
talks
It
conversations?
has.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been concerned about it as well. I mean, as soon as you see neuro, I think neuropsychiatry, I think, neuronal, responses and treatments. I don't see it as a good ground from which to start. Of course, somebody could say that about MAD. That's not a great place to start, but at least MAD isn't hyped in the present neoliberal paradigm. It's not like neuro is something that everybody gives a lot of, you know, cr- room to, a lot of
So
credit
high.
to.
People aren't, you're not driven neuro. You're driven mad. Like, poverty can
Right.
drive you mad. Can poverty drive you neurodiverse? It just sort of
Mm-hmm.
cuts off the whole conversation about social causes, trauma, suppression. Like, it just is gone because you're born brain different. I mean, it sounds like it's a terrible direction for our
Well,
movement to go.
yeah, no, totally. I certainly don't see it as confluent with
Mm,
neurodiversity. I think there
mm,
is already some discussion about that, and MAD versus neurodiversity. Can they have common ground and so on? And certainly they could. I know that there's a lot of the neurodiversity activists who hate coercion, but I also think they're experiencing some of the same problems of co-optation, right? So a lot of people will now say,
mm.
a clinician might say, "Oh, that person's neurodiverse," meaning that they have a specific disorder or something like this. So the meaning has gone out the window for them as well.
Yeah, yeah.
I also think there's something happening where somebody said, "Oh, some people call it psi diversity." So, there we are again,
Yeah,
privileging the language of the professional, the
yeah.
studier of human nature, the professional who knows all about human nature. Just look at the brain.
Well, how do
And
we how do we name it then? Because I mean, I was playing around with the idea of mental diversity and or,
or
or
emotional diversity.
emotional, or yeah, or
you
why,
know
yeah, why is it mental or emotional?
Affective
Psychic,
diversity.
soul diversity, creative
Right
diversity.
there
Yeah,
we are. Now,
yeah,
when you
exactly.
say soul diversity, I
Yeah,
kind of go, okay, we're back at the first step where Mad
yeah,
Pride kind of was, where they
yeah.
said, you know what, we're all diverse, we're all
Diverse.
different,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
all, it's not even about uniqueness, how, it's just that nobody's the same. So,
Right.
in a sense, we don't have to talk about diversity. Like, I think the wild part of neurodiversity is where they say, we're a dangerous part of it is where they say, we are actually the better human.
Oh
There's
yeah,
this sort of
that's that
transhuman
that
sort of thing
that
going
that
on.
might backfire, folks. I don't know if I would go
I
with
wouldn't
that
want
one.
yeah, and there's checks within that movement saying actually that's not a good road to go, right?
Well,
But
there's the
but
the
they're
X-Men, the mutants. We are the
right,
mutants,
right.
we're the
The
X-Men, yeah.
mutants.
Which is
Uh,
incredible. I mean, I want to do a Madness radio show just on the X-Men and the mutant metaphor allegory, because it's analogy, it gets used so
yeah,
much, and it's very alluring and very seductive because it does explain, let's just use our superpowers. I mean, the Icarus Project, we talked about this all the time. We got gifts, we got superpowers.
right,
Well, if you draw a line between the people who have powers and the people who have superpowers, you might start a war between those two sides, you know?
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, where is difference seen to be, where is difference welcomed? I suppose in the cities,
Mm.
there was a scholar at Oise who, where I studied, where, he was saying the metropole, or the center of, the empire, if you will, um, isn't necessarily cosmopolitan, but where you find cosmopolitan spots, that's where you can probably feel more welcome if you're
Mm.
gay, or if you're,
Mm.
if you're a person of color, or if you're,
Mm.
so there's,
Bohemian, artist, eccentric. Yeah. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
another example, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, so he was looking at what it means to be different in terms of where it's acceptable to be different, and I think maybe
Right.
that's kind of what our movement maybe tries for, but maybe fails in some ways. But I don't know. It depends on how you define our movement, because I don't
Yeah.
necessarily believe that it's only what has happened at, say, Mind Freedom for the
Mm.
years 1975 or whatever. I don't know when they got started, but till 1985, and then after that it was over. It was
Right.
you know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Like
Right.
I
Yeah.
I think there's a bigger way to look at what is our movement. I
Bigger.
mean, it's certainly happening in uh, in groups that are outside of my knowledge. So
Oh yeah,
um,
yeah. Like you were
you'll
saying,
see
there's so much going
groups.
on Twitter and with young
Absolutely.
people, and yeah, I mean, there's the other direction, which where people are claiming the identities and claiming the diagnosis and really identifying. So it's a lot of things going on, but um,
At the
the
same time, it's
yeah,
messy. Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah,
I'm going to say that I'm really enjoying this conversation. And conversation is a huge motivator for me in terms of getting stuff done. I think it's so important to move from where I was, as an academic who needed to defend certain ideas, and really shape them according to rigorous analysis. It's been important for me to move from that to a conversational way of exploring this stuff, because with conversation comes more connection to people, obviously, but there's a bit more connection of ideas as well. So you will hear somebody say, I'm ADHD and I'm proud, but I hate what they're doing to people in those hospitals. So
yeah, yeah,
there's that kind of morphism that's going on out there that I think, as an artist, as a musician, I need that stuff. I can't just play a kind of a military role of, like, this is the concept, I have to stick with that.
these are the
It,
talking points that our movement needs. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So I'm really enjoying what you're doing here, and that's what Crazy Talks is kind of about, right? Like, where people
mm,
kind of come to this place. They might disagree wholeheartedly, but I think it's the welcoming atmosphere that keeps it from going there. It keeps people from kind of saying, this is my thing and that's all there is to it. And I'm not gonna, you know, they don't have to defend that at that level, because everybody around them is kind of going, I don't know what you think, but this is what I think,
yeah,
and
yeah.
there's transference of ideas there. It's invisible. People don't notice somebody changing their mind or
But it's
whatever,
happening.
but it's happening,
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people I work with. Like they'll come and you'll just like, wow, you're just parroting what a psychiatrist told you. But if you don't go directly against it, you talk with the person and you listen. Like by the end of the conversation, they've just opened up, and there's all these other things going on. They're not just a carrier of us ideology. That if you saw them that way, you would put them into the position of defending that. But if you
right?
just actually go into let's listen, let's explore, because a lot of what we're talking about is just common sense. It arises from people's experience if they actually study and discover themselves and what's going on. A lot of where we're coming from is really common sense, and I think that's one of the greatest strengths that we have on our side, is that we're where the conversations are happening of different points of view. The
Hmm.
hospital is where you get the information sheet around schizophrenia and why you should take your medications. End of conversation. And as soon as you start questioning it, you're that's seen as the symptom, and you're not going to have
Hmm.
anybody talking with you. And so it's very clear. It's very clear who's on the side of freedom here, because we're not even saying we're not even saying no one should be taking medications, although that's a conversation. We're saying open up some spaces for people to not take medications. Open up some spaces where people are actually given truly informed consent about what the meds do and don't do. Just acknowledge that you're not sure
Mhm.
what these experiences are. We're not trying to go on a rampage that we have the answers. We're just saying, hey, admit that you don't have the answers and that there needs
Right.
to be diversity. And I think
Exactly.
I think the instinct, the common sense of most people is going to be like, wow, these people are making a lot of sense. The problem I think comes in when we, because I get furious, I get angry when I
Mm.
start to hear certain kinds of things, or something has happened to me the other day. I was dealing with somebody and it's just like, wow. And that I think has to do with the privilege and the oppression. Is like, we're wounded, we're really hurt. It's hard for us to have a conversation sometimes because we just feel so silenced. We just like, we do want to start to hammer our point of view. And that I think can kind of mislead the other side into thinking, well, we're the rational ones.
Right.
We're the
Right.
calm ones. We're the ones who are actually capable of having a conversation. No, you're not. There's not a lot of diversity. And there's a monologue going on over here. You're just not listening to us because there's so many angry people on our side. And that's one of the things that I'm often telling professionals, like, look, if you really want to start building alliances, that's a word that gets used, being an ally, being
Mhm.
in that position, try and listen more, even though people are angry. Don't just dismiss people when they're
Right.
angry. And I think that's true of oppression in general. It makes
Yeah.
sense.
That's
Someone
right.
facing homophobia or racism or
Mhm.
sexism, it's like, come on, you're going to be pissed off. You have
Mhm.
to have a certain tolerance.
Right.
But the establishment, the powers that be, the status quo, are characterized by that calm,
Mhm.
rational, oh, we're the rational ones here. You see, you guys aren't making any sense because you're outside yelling and we're over here having our
Mhm.
calm conversation. So clearly reason is on our side, but actually it's privilege. It's like
Yeah.
being calm is kind of a privilege in
It
some
really
ways.
is.
Yeah.
It really is. And when actually you said it right. It was when you say, but you guys don't allow for somebody to just kind of, I mean, when we do our events, right? Sorry, I'm skipping
Mhm.
all over here. When
Yeah.
we do
Yeah.
our events, and you can chop out stuff. When I'm babbling, just chop it out.
You're doing
When
great.
we do our events, part of it is to encourage people to say something. We're not expecting people to say something. If they want to pass or if they don't want to talk, that's, if they're there to listen, that's totally fine. But part of the event is to get people to see that people care what they think. People want to hear it. um
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
So
very
crucial. So crucial.
yeah. And when we do the story side of it, when we do mad stories, we say, try to give us a story about anything you want. We'll give you some prompts maybe, but say whatever you want. And by the way, we're not going to analyze your story. We're not going to take it apart and tell you about your story. We're not going to critique your story. We're not going to say this part here could use some nudging or whatever. We're trying to get people to actually tell their story with no consequence. Like the
Yeah.
way that we walked into hospitals and told our story and there were
Yeah.
life damaging
Oh,
consequences,
yeah. Yeah.
um, informs that. And I think, when you say, but you guys don't leave the space open for us, that's exactly, you know, that's the whole point. And, when I've been told the mad movement has nothing to say. And it's like, we're busy talking to each other, we're busy doing exactly what we're saying. We're busy opening
Mm.
spaces for each other. If you want us to, print it out in a Lenin-esque kind of, list of demands or what, list of, announcements, we're not going to be doing that because each one of us has a very different experience. And I think,
Mm.
we're not going to get the system to kind of come on board there because it's obviously anti that. It's anti people figuring themselves out. It's anti people sharing connections and trying to enliven them. It's anti stories mattering to people. It's all about suppressing that stuff. And
Yeah.
what can you say? I mean, it's been like that for decades, and it runs into other things like the church, and prior to 1840 or whenever it was that they kind of got started. But
Yeah.
it's definitely a system that's anti-human, if you will, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what the priesthood is doing. It's observing, analyzing, assessing, and then instructing. Like, here's your sins. Here's what you need to do to compensate for your sins. It's the same kind of. But then there is a voice that I hear sometimes, a perspective that I hear, where professionals will say, well, I don't really want to be judged and abused by these patients, these anti-psychiatry patients, that you're not really about listening to us. You're not really about. And I would say, well, instead of feeling so entitled, why not just give the person the space to be angry and
Hmm.
listen to what they're saying and be curious about why they're angry, and
Hmm.
rather than expecting that mutuality. But at the same time, I would, I do think that we need the spaces where everyone is heard equally: professionals, family members, pharma reps,
Hmm.
and patients as well. Maybe not bad faith actors if you're there getting paid to say what you're going to say,
Right.
but there's that tension, I think, between creating the conversational space and then the professionals or the family members feeling like they're the ones that are being
That need the
silenced.
space.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they need the space. No one's
Yeah.
listening to me. No one's understanding the pressures I'm under as an ER
Right.
psych
Right.
nurse, or as a mom dealing with this, son or daughter.
I mean, this reminds me of stuff like, well, I want to play the blues, or or
Mm,
I want to put on lipstick and find out, you know what I mean? As a man, obviously, as a white man,
mm,
these would be terrible moves, right?
mm,
To
mm.
enter a space that is not mine and appropriate what they're doing and
Right, right.
assume that I'm going to have the best of best of
But
time. I
but
mean,
they feel entitled to do it. They just want, yeah, yeah,
absolutely,
yeah, yeah.
absolutely. I,
Mm,
I yeah, like for privilege, entitlement, those kind of, I don't know, can we say they're kind of already stayed, or those old expressions or questions haven't really been applied, I don't think, to situations in our movement.
that's
And
right.
and I question myself too, because when somebody comes into a crazy talks and is totally demanding all the space and all the time and is in trouble, like has some major stuff going on for them, am I there for that? Am I, you know what I mean, like, am I a service to sort of help them out, or am I going to ask that person to share the space, or am I, and how am I going to do that? Right. Like it's
Yeah,
sticky. It's not a simple
very
move.
sticky.
Sanism is everywhere, including in the psychiatric survivor movement. I mean, there are people
Yeah,
making fun of craziness all the time in our movement.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we kind of get away with it because we're talking about our own or ourselves. But at the same time, we're we're not doing much better than somebody who's, yeah, usually using epitaphs in their own community. Not like, it's not really a success to
Well, you
do.
raise a really interesting point, because Lang, RD Lang, I think
Hmm.
way he described, he didn't, he talked about a lot of things, but it's at some point he's talking about people who are disturbed or disturbing. And I think that's a
Hmm.
really interesting way of looking at someone who's disturbed or disturbing, because that's really, we get into the social control aspect and the origins of the asylums as population management and rounding people up, and the poor houses and all
Hmm.
this shared history, that there is a point, and I think maybe this is a human, it could just be a human thing, where if somebody's bugging me, I don't really care whether they're drunk, whether they're bipolar, or whether they're just a jerk. Get away from me. I'm going to
Yeah.
draw a line. I'm going to draw a line. And sorry,
Hmm.
this is my event. This is
Hmm.
my house. This is my birthday party. This is whatever it is. Don't come in here and smash it up with your. And I don't care. I mean,
What it is.
I don't care
Yeah.
what it is. You're just being a jerk. You're being a jerk.
Hmm.
And if you're a jerk, you're a jerk. If you've got a bipolar diagnosis or you're a psychiatric survivor, I still, on some level, don't want you to be a jerk. And
Right.
so I do have to draw a line against the disturbance. But it raises all these kinds of issues, like, well, do we?
Right.
Do we need to? Why can't we be more compassionate towards anyone
Hmm.
who's being?
Hmm.
There's a lot of conversation happening right now about so-called, the criminal justice system and how we respond to crime. And if you see crime as just you cross a line, we're punishing you, is that the only way to look at a disturbance like crime? Or maybe it's like, oh, this is the tip of the iceberg of a whole long story of something that built up. Thank you for pointing out. Thank you for calling my attention to something that needs to be addressed in the community that we're not addressing. So what do you think about that? What do you think about
Yeah.
that aspect of madness as you can't be compassionate because the guy is the whoever it is the person is crossing a line.
I mean,
They're
I,
violating me.
boundaries have been critiqued quite readily in the academy. I mean, everybody's talking
Mm,
about boundaries as bad ideas in international warfare, but not
mm,
so much in psycho studies, in
mm.
psychoanalysis, psychotherapy. Not so much there. I mean, boundaries are important,
Seems like
and
it.
and yet, it's true. It's how am I going to get to this place of reflecting on all of human, differentiations, differences, whatever, without, while still wanting to draw those sort of neoliberal boundaries. Um, my
Right.
feeling is that
Property, the
there are
property,
times
the property
the,
line.
the
Property.
property line,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
there. I think for me, it's not a simple. It's a dichotomy that sometimes I am just, I'm not able to be there with that person, and
Yeah.
I can't, do that. So I'm going to back away, or I'm going to find some other space. I don't know if I'm going to draw a line in the ground and, expect them to back off, because I think that that's, yeah, pretty white guy kind of thing to do, maybe, but not exactly my way of doing it, but I might at some point, you know. Um, but mostly, I think, there are times when I actually say, okay, you know what, I'm going to give you a little bit more room here than I normally would want to give you, because I've got more time and I'm actually
Right.
invested in interpersonal understandings. Um, I mean, is that too, is that too bougie of me to, have time when I want it and not have time when I mean, do we all not have limits? I mean, I can only do so many hours a day without going to sleep,
But
or
you're kind of saying that maybe we should have more space and have less limits, and
if
maybe
we had,
a lot of our
yeah,
excuse. I mean, a lot of our excuses like "Don't stress me out. I don't have enough bandwidth for this. I don't have time for you." Is that really my limits, or are those the pressures that I'm
hmm,
under as a
thank you.
consumer
Hmm.
worker in a capitalist society? That,
Hmm.
like, I think one of the best things we could do to help people with going through distress and madness is just have more time. Like
Hmm.
people are working less, so you're hanging out more, you have more free time, so you have more free
Right.
time to listen to each other and
Absolutely.
figure out what the guy who lives half a block away needs in that
Yeah.
house you walk by all the time that seems like it's boarded up, and no one ever talks to him because he's a recluse, but everybody's busy working. And if we all had time, if there was something like universal basic income where we had free space and volunteerism available to us, we might knock on the door and reach out and start a relationship to the people in our community that are falling through the cracks. Or if there were more spare rooms, like I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation where if we just had a spare room, if somebody had a guest bedroom that this person could crash at
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
month, they
Yeah.
wouldn't need to go to the freaking hospital. And then,
Right.
okay, everybody in the house is going to work and they don't have, well, what if somebody was around, could just help the guy, cook
Yeah.
him a meal every day, spend some time hanging out and talking with him because they're not working so hard. So a lot of what we call madness and mental health crisis is really kind of like the last stop downstream of all these
Mhm.
upstream
Right.
problems. So I
Absolutely.
like your questioning about, like, well, maybe these boundaries are and the limits are maybe kind of need to question, why do we have these limits about
Hmm.
disturbing behavior? Why is it we don't have more time to be taking time out of our day to deal with strangers on the street, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
I mean, I think that a lot of political movements have this problematic exists in political movements because we're still dealing with those constraints from society that tell us where to
Yeah.
be and what to do, and how many days, how many hours we get in a day, and so on. So it's kind of like we're all coming at each other from a pressure cooker, and
Yeah.
this is great again for interlopers, or people who want to saddle us, is when they say, Well, one great thing is when you're just simply ignorant, right? Like I haven't read my Marx enough. I think
Mm.
I've read a few paragraphs, so somebody will say I'm absolutely ignorant of what's happening in class war, and I'll be like, yeah, like, but do I get time to get unignorant, or like, do I get do I get any space to actually take up what you're so completely involved in here? And a lot of movements don't have that for us. Um they don't give us the time or the space to acclimatize, figure things out, like question things. And we end up with, again, a reproduction of the original upstream, as you say, um, constraints,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, we have to wriggle out of that, because there's not going to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There's not going to be okay, we finally did it. Like Lenin took Russia and took it out of the Tsar's hands, but he immediately went into crisis mode, and
Yeah.
Russia suffered.
Yeah.
I mean, don't ask me what happened to communism under his rule, because I don't think that was communism. But that was the end of that. Like,
Yeah.
as soon as he had to contend with his opposition, um, you know, the ideas kind of floated away, I think. So I think it's really important that we give space to each other like that, where we can, and where we can't, where the constraints upstream prevent us from doing so. I don't think that we have to, sit there and say, you're not good enough for me, or you're not crossing this boundary. That's mine. It's like, we don't have to do all of that work. We can just say, I don't know. I'm gonna take off. I need to run away. you know,
It's
and
interesting
sometimes
thinking.
yeah.
It's interesting thinking about my own life, because I've kind of, from very early on, I realized like time is important. Time is important, and the society is going to try and steal my time. So I got to set it up where I'm not working 60 hours a week. And some people would say, well, that's really foolish. You should have been working 60-hour weeks in your 20s and 30s, because then you'd build the nest egg, you'd have the mortgage, you'd have the property. And like, well, that's your view of
Hmm.
reality. My view of reality is like, I've had maybe more. I mean, I had a lot of it was stolen by psychiatry and
Right.
stolen by that whole detour. But there's something just basic about, I think that a friend from Greece, when they are still dealing with crisis, they said, less work, more life. Because there were so
Hmm.
many people who were unemployed, and they were trying to reinvent that of like, hey, we have more time, and I
Hmm.
think that's a big lesson, I think, is that a lot of our mental health so-called crisis and the mental health system breakdown isn't like the lack of good treatments and even good ideology. It's just like it's a social problem that the society has, like you've said, become a pressure cooker. People are
Right.
just like, it's driving all of us crazy, and there's no spaces outside of that to learn how to take care of you. And we can debate about open dialogue, and we can debate about hearing voices groups, but unless we have time to take care of each other, we're just going to be like catching bodies that are being killed upstream. We're going to be catching
Right.
them downstream.
Right. And even when it's not distress, even when it's spiritual, or like my
Yeah.
experiences were really existential. They were really open ended, um, and there was so much to them that was a celebration of living.
Yeah. Right on.
um the even like, so when we look at the way that when they push us and they push us and they push us, and we pop out like that, in a
Right.
state of gratefulness, you know um there's something to that too, in that you know maybe we don't have to always be working to shelter ourselves from all of that. Maybe sometimes we need to be affirming each other's positive
Yeah.
experiences, um, and giving each other that sort of, that somebody's noticed us doing that. Like, when the Hearing Voices movement got started with Marius Rom and I forgot, is it Escher?
Sandra Escher.
Yeah, it was very much about containing a crisis, or dealing with it. Not containing, that's right. They went that step further. They were talking about working with somebody in crisis, but it wasn't, it wasn't looking at that experience as having all of that, all 360 degrees of maybe, if children are experiencing voices, for example, maybe it's not always a bad thing. Maybe it's a kind of a natural sort of thing that we go to, maybe it's an experience that needs to be seen in positive and negative.
Yeah, I really like that, because when I was talking and thinking about like making space in the society, it's not just making space for when you're in distress or you're suffering or you're disabled, but just making space for your thing. Like,
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
may not understand it, um but it's meaningful to you, and it could be very positive. You just need some time, and you're just, I mean, if I look at my own life, the ebbs and flows and ups and downs, and yeah, I needed time to just figure things out. I think that's, I think, a lot of what happens with young people is they hit college and everybody around them has a career lined up, and they're just like, wow. And then they're supposed to like figure out, they need some time. They need to get out on the road, or just try some different day jobs, just two different. They don't necessarily need all this pressure to just figure out but we don't give people that space. I'm curious about this whole thing about spaces and spaces in your own life, Eric. I mean, I imagine you identify as a mad person. You identify as what is your own madness like look like? Is it just, what is it? Like, what is your, I mean, I could maybe say what mine is, but what is
Um,
your thing?
I'm gonna run back to the word privilege. I had
Oh,
the privilege of being what people would call crazy, what I called accelerating at the time, actually.
accelerating. I like that.
Accelerating.
Yeah.
I was 16, and I mean, I think that I had already kind of touched into sort of some new agey kind of ideas, and I was into, astronomy and astrology and stuff. So I was already cooking stuff that was a little bit out there, but I wanted to kind of follow, I guess what I would call fantasies of living, or dreams, into real time, into everyday life. And I had the privilege to do so. I was just a kid in school, working class kid, in a northern Ontario town, and I had nothing really to worry about. I was doing my studies, and I sort of started letting that happen. And this was before any kind of drugging or any kind of, so I
Mm.
had a lot of time to work this out. Now, since then, I've recognized that some people can't just do that. They have pressures that are going to bring them down when they do that. It's not something
Mm.
you just do lightly. I didn't have pressures, so I could actually invest time in that experience, write about it, totally get into it. And after, well, I think it was maybe 3 days later, I was like, if I keep going down this road, it's going to be too magnetic. I'm not going to be able to let it go.
Why did you say
And
that? Was it something,
I
what
could
was in
just
there? Like, what was seductive
tell that it was, yeah,
energy, just accelerating, like not
uh,
sleeping? Like,
it was
were you
it,
writing poetry or
I
making
was
novels?
writing
Oh,
poetry.
yeah.
I was making drawings, and
Poetry,
it was,
poetry is really dangerous. Got to watch out for poetry
you
for
got to
sure.
watch out for poetry. Yeah, it was a, the dangers were that I was enjoying it too much. The
Huh.
dangers were, and because I was already a pretty cautious individual at the time, I was like, okay, so this is good. I really like this, but I really need to, balance it out with something else. So for
Decelerate.
decelerate it,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And that's what I did. So I did boring things, and I listened to boring stuff, and that slowed me down. And I would continue to use that through my life. Like, it was often in times of pain or confusion that I would say, okay, I need to recheck what that was all about. What was that experience about? And then I would start in on that experience again.
Mm,
um, this is why I kind of, even in my book, I say, not everything is negative. Sometimes it's
right.
it's actually a positive thing. It's not just a coping mechanism, as it were. It's really, fantasy is a place we go to while we're asleep, while we're listening to
Hmm.
droning speeches, while we're, like, it's a place we should honor more and
Yeah,
really
yeah.
give space to more often, because I think we would probably find some soothing part of ourselves there, you know. Um, so in a sense, it was just chasing fantasies. But I say that just it should be. I was actually opening up my life to something that everybody should take up as a
Yeah,
you can allow yourself to think through or feel through certain things that you wouldn't be able to do in real life,
that's right. Yeah,
and you're going to learn something from that quasi experience. It is an experience. You're there in a sense.
yeah,
So I would, through my life, I I did that all the way up until where I was in a different city with no friends, and that happened, and then I got a little bit, um,
mm,
what was it, when I started talking a little bit weird, the head of the bakery that I was working at decided to call the the authorities,
yeah,
and that's where my book starts. It starts from there, the conversations I was having with the ambulance driver,
yeah. And the
with the
rest is
madness
history.
chaser. Yeah, yeah. So it's a weird thing. I mean, I've been in the movement looking at stuff like, poverty and the downsides of it, and Mad Pride kind of came up, and I was like, it was a breath of fresh air for me, because it opened up this possibility that actually Mad Gifts as a good example.
Hmm.
Actually, this stuff can be more than just you know the pre institutionalization part.
Right.
It can be more than that, right?
Yeah. Well,
Or
that's
more
also
than suffering, anyway.
more than
Yeah,
suffering. Yeah, that's, I mean, that I think is characteristic of the human experience that the disease model doesn't understand at all, that we make meaning out of suffering, that out
yeah.
of suffering, out of our, I mean, think of like the greatest stories, the greatest dramas, the greatest is always about adversity and suffering and conflict, and terrible things are happening, and then you surpass them, you overcome them, and that you are changed, you grow, you get stronger, you get wiser, you get transformed, you become something different. And the disease model is just like, oh, the machine is broken, let's fix the machine and get you back on the road. Well, actually, that's not how humans operate. We operate through myths, we operate through stories, and through heroism, and through surviving ordeals, and initiation, and rites of passage, and transformation. And to me, that's
Absolutely.
that's why that's why I think the trauma framework is really interesting in a way, because trauma has kind of become, oh, you're a broken machine,
Right.
let's fix you. You're dysregulated, let's get your
Yes.
regulator, let's get your carburetor back in tune. I mean, it's like it's become this very mechanistic thing, which is ironically appealing to a lot of people who would reject mechanism in other areas of medicine.
Hmm.
But trauma is very interesting to study, because so much gift comes out of trauma,
Right.
so much initiation, that shamanism, it's through traumatic illness, like madness and accident and disease or addiction, that the shaman gets initiated. The rite of passage is done, all the ordeal medicine, the going through an extreme intense experience in order to have a vision, going on a
Hmm.
vision quest. I mean, this is like basic human 101
Yep.
that we need
Yep.
to. And the way that it becomes meaningful is through storytelling, fantasy, imagination, because it's a survival mechanism. It's part of what our organism does. We will generate fantasy in order to understand and deal with and make meaning out of difficult situations, so we can learn from them and grow and change, and become bigger in who
Yeah.
we are. So
You know,
the fact that psychiatry just colonizes suffering and just turns it into a disease, it's just it's horrific. It's like, it really is. I mean, colonization is I think the right word for it. It's certainly the imposition of one religious fanaticism on the
yes,
rest of
yes.
us, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, it's definitely a gaslighting, or you know, and I just also want to pop in that even if we don't overcome, our
Yeah,
whatever our limitations are, um, that we can imagine beyond them, outside of them, is really, really important, and needs more. Yeah, needs more. People should be proud that they can think beyond what's happening to them, even in the Sisyphean struggle that we seem to be in in this reality, in this on this
Mm,
planet, watching the thing just die and nobody doing anything about it, just waiting for their paychecks,
yeah.
and the people at the top holding on to power. I mean, we can stop there if we need to, but why only stop there? I mean, because that's only one way of thinking. Another way of thinking is to think about things that are not even possible in this realm, and
Mm.
that has all kinds of things to do with mad people's experiences, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really right. I'm thinking about the Tony Iommi, the guitarist for Black Sabbath, who I learned like in
Right.
his early days as a guitarist. He's a factory worker and he sliced off his fingertips.
Oh shit, are you
Yeah, he
serious?
sliced off his fingertips in a factory accident. And of course, the doctor says, "Oh, sorry, no more guitar for you."
Yeah.
And then he goes home and he figured out how to out of leather and a soap like a dish soap bottle. He like fashioned prosthetics for his
Holy
because
shit.
someone had told him about Django Reinhardt, the brilliant guitarist who had his fingers burned, his hands burned in a fire, and then he went on and just became this incredible world famous
Hmm.
one of the greatest guitarists. And someone had told him about Django Reinhardt, and Tony Iommi is like, I'm gonna figure out how to play. And he ends
I've
up
never
like
heard that.
developing, yeah, he ends up developing being the development of an entire new genre of music,
Hmm.
heavy metal, that's based
Hmm.
on how he was had to retune his guitar and kind of modify his technique because of
Didn't
these
know that.
it's an incredible, and it's one of the reasons those stories are so compelling is because it's just as you said, it's based on the imagination. He was able to
Hmm.
imagine something that the
Hmm.
doctor couldn't, and he was
Hmm.
able to just keep going and go through it, and then this whole new thing comes out. And I think that's exactly what mad people, we have something very, I don't know what it is. I don't know, I don't think I've seen it yet. I don't really, but we have something very special to offer in this crisis of apocalypse, ecological decline. Everything is falling apart, meaning is going,
Hmm.
is just crumbling. I think we have something very very special. And I was sort of talking about Greta Thunberg and I mentioned, her about when we were talking about autism. I mean, there's something very significant about the how she became this global voice and leader as
Hmm.
basically a child who's not not operating in a so-called normal range of
Yep.
human interaction and community and communication. And I think there's something in, I think the place we can discover it, whatever that thing is I'm pointing to, is in the conversations that like you're talking about. This is why I admire your work so much, is that you really get it, that it's about connection, it's about storytelling, it's about sharing your voice and weaving those relationships with other people. And so the more we can do that, I think the better.
And I think you just doing this is part of that for me. I'm,
Great.
I was a little worried because I've been kind of out of the, out of the discussions, like public discussions for a long time, and but this gives me more hope as we've been talking about hope and stuff. It's kind of like, yeah, you know, um, our conversations drift into other conversations, and that's just the way we do things. So that's how humans do things. It's important that we do those things. So yeah, we've maybe our movement is a little bit different from a true leader kind of version of things. Maybe we do things together more than we think we do. Maybe we've worried about proposing itemized lists and great figureheads and all that, but I think we do things together more often.
Beautiful. Well, listen, Eric, thank you so much. Do you want to say how people can get in touch with you and
Sure.
find out more about your work, and remind us about your book if they want to get a copy of your book, Tranquil Prisons, and just tell us about you and how to contact you.
Sure. I'm gonna should I I'll spell it out on the side here and verbally. People can get in touch with Madly, Madly, at a company called Tech Savvy, TEKSAVVY.com. And that would be an email to get in touch with the group, with me, in terms of mad stories and crazy talks, but also just with me about anything. And people can find my book just by doing a Google search for it. You can go through University of Toronto Press if you're interested in University of Toronto.
Or your independent local bookseller, we like to say as well.
Unlikely, but I'd like to fantasize.
They can
about
usually
that.
they can order stuff. I think.
Well, they can order it in. Yeah, that's right.
Get
it kind of shipped instead of to your door. Yeah. So, and you can also get it online too. There's an online book as well, Tranquil Prisons.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Erick Fabris, for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Thank you, Will. It's been great having a conversation with you.
You've been listening to an interview with Erick Fabris. Erick is a longtime psychiatric survivor activist in Canada. He was part of the West End Survivors in Toronto, which set up the first Mad Pride in Canada. And Erick has worked with the Patients Council advisors to a hospital in Toronto for 10 years. That was the largest psych hospital, one of the largest psych hospitals in Canada, CAMH. He's the author of the book Tranquil Prisons, which is about community forced treatment, community treatment orders. That was published in 2011. And he is the founder of Crazy Talks and Mad Stories, which is creative community events in Toronto, Canada. Thanks a lot for joining us today on Madness Radio. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio host is Will Hall, producer is Nina Packabush. Madness Radio is an affiliate of Mad in America Radio, broadcasting on KBOO in Oregon, sponsored by Portland Hearing Voices and the Icarus Project, and syndicated on the Pacifica Network. Madness Radio is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio and at madinamerica.com.